Hello, and welcome to another episode of the ID Talk podcast. My name is Tony Bitsionis, and I'm here with my great friend, Alex Perala. Alex, hello.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm just fine. How are you?
Just fine. Um, Today we've got a great chat with a friend of the show, Danielle VanZandt. She's been on before. She's a research manager for Frost and Sullivan in their commercial and public security division. Danielle is here to talk to us about a big news item from the past few days. But before we get to that, Alex, is there anything that you want to touch on?
Yeah, just a couple things that I think are worth highlighting for listeners. One is that the SIA put out a report that's basically like a industry survey of security industry professionals. And we covered it because, of course, the biometrics and identity technology folks are a part of the security industry. And it was interesting. There was some interesting stuff about political leanings that we don't need to get into in there, but I found it interesting. Although I will note that about half of the respondents basically were like, they were asked, do you think that the outcome of the presidential election will affect your industry? And they were like, nah. So yeah, so that's interesting.
Take that into consideration.
But generally, I just want to highlight it because the tone of it was generally like pretty upbeat.
Mhm.
Um, people, I get the sense that a lot of the professionals who responded were basically like things have been stalled for political reasons, partly for a while, but after the election's over, things are just kind of going to go back to normal and business is
Right.
pick up. That was the vibe I got. But we're hoping to talk with a couple people from the SIA in the coming weeks. We can delve into this a little more with them. So maybe that's all I'll say about that for now. Uh,
Yeah.
and the other thing I wanted to flag, just because I saw this was kind of blowing up a little bit on LinkedIn, was this new Gartner report that
Right.
had a forecast that at least 500 million smartphone users will be regularly using digital ID wallets by 2026. So what I was seeing on my feed, at least, was people were generally like, wow, that's a lot.
Yeah.
And it is. And it's definitely like Gartner is calling the boom in digital
Mhm.
IDs, mobile-based IDs in particular. But to me, it does seem like, I don't know, kind of a modest prediction because
Mhm.
this is by 2026. Also, by 2026, the EU is supposed to have rolled out a digital ID wallet across
Mhm.
its member states. And that, like today, there's like 450 million people living there. So
Mhm. Yeah.
I don't know how that's forecast to grow in the next couple of years, but maybe it'll shrink from some of the stuff I've been hearing. But it's still like that's just the EU. And then, what about Asia and America and South America, like India? I don't know. It seems like there's huge markets where digital ID is also starting to sprout up.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I feel like maybe that's more of a modest prediction than some people might realize, or maybe I don't know.
I
I'm not.
agree. And when I saw it, I had to kind of do a double take or just look a little bit closer because I wasn't sure, first of all, that I saw the 500 million number right. And then when I saw it was 500 million, I was trying to figure out if they were talking about just within a certain region. And yeah, I mean, you're right. Like Europe alone, even if half of Europe's population is enrolled in this digital ID program, that's you know 275 million people or whatever the math is, the basic simple math that I should be able to do. I'm stalling not to do it in my head. Um, so we and like we've talked about this before, digital ID programs and developments. around the world come up often, and they come across our desks all the time, and we're reporting on them and we're talking about them with guests. So to think that the number would be that surprisingly not, astronomical was you know, I felt the same way. I just did a little bit of a we'll see.
Yeah.
We'll
And
see who has the last laugh.
uh, I guess my caveat that I just thought of was that what we are seeing, because we're kind of on the front line of watching this develop. It's all this stuff is happening so quickly, and I guess it's possible there will be a huge political backlash that we're
Right,
starting to see.
right.
Um, that is like on the fringes right now, but maybe that'll grow. But
You're right.
we,
And I mean, I do suppose it is. We're 3 months out from 2025. So that really only gives a, a year,
yeah,
15, 16 months for 500 million mobile ID users to be enrolled. So who knows? Maybe it's just the beginning of a really steep curve,
mhm.
um, growth curve. But I guess we'll see. We'll either be made to look like fools or the geniuses that we think we are.
Indeed.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's all the news I wanted to flag, and I also wanted to ask you to explain another news item, just because this is what our chat is going to be about. We
Hmm.
spoke with Danielle VanZandt about IN Group's um, exclusive talks to buy a part of Idemia.
Yeah.
Uh, really big news. Really set a lot of people abuzz in our
Hmm.
industry. So before we get to our conversation with her, which was great, I got a lot more information and perspective out of that even than I anticipated.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
so yeah, I'm really glad we were able to get a hold of her. But before we get to that, we should just lay out the basics. So Tony, can you please remind me what's the deal? Literally.
Yeah, first of all, the conversation was great. Danielle was really excited to talk to us. We were really excited to talk to her. We kind of set it up on the fly because the news dropped and it was such a big deal. But just all you really need to know going into this is that, as you said, In Group, which is a France-based entity wholly owned by the French government,
And which
um,
Danielle says IN group,
IN Group.
which is
Yeah,
probably correct, but
that's
I also
probably
been just saying and thinking in group.
yeah, sure. So let's just say IN Group, owned by the French government, is in talks to buy Idemia's identity division from Advent International, in a deal that is speculated to be worth around 1.1 billion. I think that's in US dollars. I believe it's in US dollars. I'm not sure if it was in euros,
Uh,
but
yeah, well, euros and US. A billion euros is 1.1 US.
okay, there we go. So I was right, double right. And this is a deal that they're in talks right now. It is expected to be completed in the first half of 2025. I don't recall if it's first quarter or first half, but let's just say in early 2025. And it's just a really big story. I mean, we talk about it with Danielle, and it's in the article on our site on ID Tech Wire. But the rumors have been swirling for a few years that Idemia was going to be selling off parts of its identity business or all of its identity business. And this raises some questions that we address or that we try to address with, like, to the best of our knowledge, speculating, of course, but what's going to happen in the meantime? What does it mean to be selling to a company entirely owned by the French government? You know,
Hmm.
stuff like that. And we ask Danielle a bunch of questions, and we have a great time trying to figure out what's going to happen.
Yeah, and it's cool like connecting the dots between us on the like journalistic side and Danielle on
Hmm.
the analyst side. We each have our own like little glimpses of what was
Yeah.
happening behind the scenes, so that it was funny to connect the dots. And I should also mention that for those who may not know, Idemia only formed, in 2017, and that was when the company that owns Idemia, Advent, merged Safran. and Oberthur Technologies. So it was like I was around at the time in this industry. I was writing about it, and I remember it was a huge deal, and it was like this is going to create like a gigantic company,
Yeah.
and um, and it certainly did, and that may factor into what's going on now, as Danielle will explain. So
Yep.
really, it's I was so glad we got to talk to her. It's a very interesting conversation.
Yeah. Should we get to it?
Let's get to it.
Let's get to it.
All right, we are very happy to welcome back to the show Danielle VanZandt of Frost and Sullivan. Friend of the show, Danielle was on earlier this year giving us a kind of big picture look at the overall industry. And she's back this time to talk mainly, I think, about the recent news that In Group is in talks to acquire Idemia. We Everybody knows this is big news. Idemia is one of the biggest companies in the industry and beyond. So really worth digging into what this might mean. So Danielle, welcome back.
Thanks. It's great to
Back.
be here.
So where to start? I guess we should start with the backstory. I know that leaks about this came out, yeah, I want to say early 2022, somewhere around there.
Mhm.
And I don't think anything was officially announced at that time, but there was, I want to say, like Reuters story that there were talks. Advent International owns Idemia, and they were talking about selling it. And there was talk at the time of either selling it in total or breaking it into pieces.
Mhm.
And now we have news that they are in fact breaking it into pieces. And I believe it's the Identity Security Division. I forget the exact name of it that is now on
I think it's
the block.
IST is the one that would be sold.
Okay. And I think they're talking about €1 billion price tag
Yeah.
for that.
I've seen 1.1 to about like 1.8 in a couple different stories
Oh,
so
wow.
far.
Hmm.
And I've seen like a total for Idemia of like 3.6 to 5 point something billion. So when we say big news, we really do mean it here.
Yeah.
So we chatted about this a little bit before we started recording here, but you were saying that there was a lot of chatter about this a couple
Yeah.
years ago, and you were kind of listening in pretty closely. So how have you been tracking it since then, if you've been able to?
It's been very on the DL. So it's
Mm.
kind of been, the high school rumor mill in the industry almost. And it goes back for, gosh, maybe towards 2020-ish. Not not about the IN group sale, but potential other ventures that Idemia was going to make. They did a big reshuffle of their executives and their business units back at the end of 2020 into 21, I remember, because we did talk to them a couple of times for various studies, because as you said, Idemia is a huge business, covers a lot of the research areas that my team looks at. So we're consistently in contact with them somehow.
Mm.
Um, and at the time, it was the potential of them selling off their whole business or potentially merging with another French security company. But of course, similarly to this deal, actually, that was going to be subject to French government approvals. And then that rumor kind of fell off in 2021 and it almost went like radio silent.
Mm.
So I've kind of had this feeling that something was still happening with them because they were still being very quiet. Noticed things that like the analyst relations page got a little bit more locked down, wasn't updated as much. Their product releases were a little bit more on the like airport security and identity side versus the biometrics side. So I figured that something was still going on. And when I last did my research update at the end of 22 and early 23, it was kind of the same thing. We couldn't, and now we know why. We couldn't really chat with them as much as we did before for our research.
Mm.
Come to find out from these stories, it looks like that was about the heyday of the IN group and those talks finally coming to a head and then moving it into French government approvals, which I think the only reason we're hearing about it now is that it's finally approved. So I can
Yeah,
understand the need to stay quiet, but
Mhm.
it just kind of left it to the rumor mill for a couple of years.
yeah. I wanted to pick up on that government thing because I remember 2 years ago when I was writing about this, there was like a certain amount of hand-wringing about whether this could be antitrust issue, like depending on
Exactly.
how it was sold and would the government approve it. And then when I was reading about the news that just came out, I believe I read that In Group is owned to some extent by the French government or like,
They're
yeah,
wholly owned by the
wholly
French
owned.
government.
Okay, so does that just solve that problem? Like the
I
government owns it, so it's not a market competition issue.
I don't think it fully goes away because of that.
Hmm.
I think with the French government, and I am no expert on French regulatory laws by any way, shape, or form, but I think the fact that IN Group is wholly owned by the government and them buying privately owned Idemia wouldn't raise as many antitrust flags as Idemia merging or being bought by another private company. I have
Mhm.
the feeling that's probably why it's being allowed.
That makes sense. Um, yeah, and then like just looking at the bigger picture, then what do you think this means, assuming it goes forward? Like what impact would this have on the industry and like a larger scale?
I think we have a couple questions that we still need to have answered. So I think I saw that the sale is officially finalized early 25.
Hmm.
So one thing I would want to know, and I don't clearly have this answer yet, um, is if Idemia, the name, the brand, is still going to remain its own, or the IN group has a pretty comprehensive biometrics and um, more hardware-centric portfolio. So is it going to be a blend of both? Is Idemia just being put in with In Group's portfolio, but the brand is going to slowly peter out? Um, and I think that would, depending on which scenario happens, that could change my long-term projection.
Hmm.
Um, Idemia is a very recognized name. So taking that brand out of the market could be a problem for IN Group because they don't have the same recognition globally that Idemia does. Um, However, it could also help where IN Group almost feels like the new vendor in the market, even if it's a similar solution or the same solution that saw Idemia's success and they just get to take it over, already have this very established base of customers and only have to work on continued expansions.
Hmm.
So depending on which scenario happens, I could see it going one of those two ways.
Yeah, that was going to be my question. Actually, pretty much just answered it, but just is this something that'll have like a, well, in your opinion, obviously we don't know yet, but a major impact on the way Idemia operates, I guess even in the short term, like between now and whenever the sale is finalized next year, when there's like a big sale like this, is there, do you know, I mean, if there usually are terms attached to the way that the company who's being acquired does business until the date that the sale goes through?
I Until the sales goes through, and even like the first couple of months after, I know it can get messy
Mhm.
because um I'm thinking about a couple consolidations in like the threat intelligence industry that I follow too. Um, and I remember walking up to a vendor and being like, "Hey, I've been trying to contact you," and they're like, "This merger is a mess. I have no idea who my boss is anymore. I don't know what branding I'm using." Like they had
Yeah.
both companies swag at the trade show, so um, that all has to get figured out at that organizational level. And then you have the challenge of teaching the market which way is now up.
Hmm.
So reaching out to media like you guys or us in the analyst community to tell us which way we're going here so we can potentially help tell that story. You know, I'm doing updates to my biometrics research in 25. I don't know yet how they'll fit in. Will it be
Mhm.
IN Group? Will it be Idemia? Who knows?
Yeah, because I mean, I
Sorry.
can't even imagine um, the number of employees and managers and just people that are involved
Well, and then think
in
about,
something like this big. So you can imagine. Go
well,
ahead.
and then also think about the number of deployed systems out there under the
Yeah.
Idemia name. And that customer base has to be informed as well.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Not even talking about reaching out to potential new customers at that point. So it definitely causes a little bit of a delay in that
Hmm.
sense, because how do you sell a new thing if you don't know your identity corporately?
Hmm.
Yeah. And identity is the key issue.
I was
True.
wondering if you would pluck that one, Alex.
Yeah, the
I
irony
always
of it
go for
right
the
now.
low-hanging fruit. Um, I was gonna say also, like, I wonder, just based on what you were just saying, Danielle, if this could be some sort of short-term opportunity for Thales, because they're widely seen as a rival to Idemia, and I know a couple of years ago the rumor was they were going to buy Idemia.
Mhm.
Now it's like, I don't know, is chaos a ladder for them that they're gonna now swoop in and be like, we know who we are, and you'll know like which salesperson to talk to if you work with us or something like that.
It definitely could be, especially because of how complementary both of those companies were when it came to their major markets. Um, Thales, while it does have good global presence, even here in North America, biometrics wise, they really don't have as much biometrics business here, kind of similar to Idemia. Um, and then, of course, those two are competing neck and neck in Europe and Middle East, Africa, Latin America. Um, and then, of course, you have NEC in the background as well. And I definitely could see NEC using this to their advantage outside of Europe to potentially gather a little bit more, especially with everything that they're putting in their biometrics portfolio at the moment. Um, so that is a push that I could see NEC making in surrounding regions. Europe could definitely be the big battleground, though, with Thales. Their biometrics portfolio has been become very use case centric, though. So, getting back to more of that broad applicability that Idemia has a little bit more of, that could be the one hurdle Thales has to overcome. But if they do that, then it could definitely be a big moment for them to capture some customers
Mm.
without having to worry about it in the background.
I wonder also if, and maybe you've seen something like this before, so I'm just curious what you think. Is there any possibility of like Thales or NEC suing over this to be like, if the French government is buying our rival, like that's all our contracts gone that we might have got with the French government. Like,
Right.
I just kind of wonder how that would.
Yeah. I don't see NEC doing it just because of the global reach NEC has, um, and also localized presence. Thales being a French company, they definitely have more of a standing to try and say something like that. Thales can also say if it was true that they were in talks to merge, hey, why are you okay with it now?
Yeah.
Um, so I could see that being something on the backside, but I wish I knew more about the French regulatory environment because maybe that would have that kind of answer for us.
Hmm. I have also kind of a conspiratorial leaning question. Not really from my end, but I like to think about this stuff because Tony and I, every once in a while, we do write about the concerns that certain elements have about things like digital ID
Mhm.
and worries about governments controlling digital ID and things like that. And I wonder how this is going to look to them. That like private company that specializes in biometrics and digital ID will now be effectively owned by the French government. Is that a crazy thing to worry about? Or as like an analyst, do you see that maybe being...
I can see the conspiratorial lean. The fact that it's a French company and GDPR is what I think could assuage everything. You know, if we were talking about this same thing going on in the States, ooh, I could see that being a big talking point right now. But since they're doing this in France with GDPR in place, with the AI Act, with everything else that the European Commission's putting out, I think those worries are a little bit more assuaged. There's definitely that contracting question, though, about what does this mean for additional government contracts for the French national ID system? What does this mean for any potential other mobile identity, biometric identity vendor in the French market? Those are definitely big questions to consider. So we'll have to see how this organizational model is going to be done. Is IDEMIA going to be kind of how they were under Advent, where they were still pretty independent? Or is there going to be more of a heavy hand? I could see it going either way just because the Macron administration is so technocratic. So that'll be another piece to keep an eye on too.
Hearing about this, like how messy it is, now I'm just kind of going back to a basic question I maybe should have asked at the top, which is, why are they doing this? why are they selling it? What's the benefit?
I think it got to a point where maybe IDEMIA was just too big. You know, we were just talking about the figures of the business units. You know, right at the start of the year, IDEMIA broke itself into 3. And so, and I think they had to. I'm thinking about, like, in my, you know, all the coverage that my team does on the research side, IDEMIA touches so many of our markets, but we end up talking to so many different groups within IDEMIA. So I think it just got to a point where organizationally they were just too big and too unwieldy to continue any kind of technological pace. Because I don't think tech companies can really keep developing if they get a little too big for the market or dabble in too many things. It's the master of none versus master of one.
I know we're running maybe a little bit low on time, but I need your take on my take. I want to know if this actually makes sense, because when we were working on the story, I was pointing out that when the leaks first came out that Advent was thinking of selling IDEMIA, it was at a very frothy time in the stock market. Like, and in global markets, it was like a year or two into the pandemic, a lot of capital had been pumped into the economy. And then the leak came out like almost perfectly at the wrong time. It was like Ukraine had just been invaded. Inflation was becoming a serious concern. I think even the Fed had just done its first rate hike, like right around that time. So markets like plummeted, and my read was like, oh, they weren't going to sell when the market was completely being destroyed. And that was part of why I thought everything just went quiet. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think that same time you're talking about was when I started having those varied conversations and started to see the executive leadership changeovers that I was seeing. And then like 22, which was a little bit better of a year, but still had the inflationary issues. That was when they started going really, really quiet. I also think it had to do with, you know, this was when IDEMIA was all together. So the airport and defense and government sector, having that being such a core and majority part of IDEMIA's business, and those were so heavily hit by the pandemic that they were not spending at the levels that they used to. that definitely had a big business impact on them. And one that I think continued up until that 22, 23 timeframe. So that could also be playing a little bit into, let's recover our prices and our value just a little bit more, see if we can make it before we try this again.
Yeah.
And does it seem like this move, which has been in the works for, what did we say, almost 4 years, or at least 2 years, has been kind of looming, like hanging over the heads of Idemia for the last couple of years, kind of with all the other things you just described, the impacts of the pandemic and the fluctuations in the market. This whole thing has been on the horizon the entire time, hasn't it?
Yeah. And I think even us on the outside started to realize it, because it's like I said earlier, and I think you guys alluded to it too, they got very quiet the last few years. It was very hard to find information on their new product updates. The AR side kind of shut down, went under almost like a password protected lock at one point, that us as analysts just could not get information out of them. And so I think that, and the leadership changeovers, even some that I saw new executives come in and leave very quickly. So I think organizationally, that culture, they knew something was happening. And now that I'm thinking about it, seeing that shift in perspective in 22, when, the time that the IN group put forward this bid, that was also a big shift over in French policy, more towards technology-centric policy. Like Macron really wanted to create French owned and operated a technology sector. And so with the size of this deal, that really accomplishes that kind of goal for them.
For what it's worth, from our side, like I feel, at least for me, the few times I've tried to reach out to people at Idemia over the last year, I want to say, it's not really, I don't think I've really got emails back.
Yeah, same here.
So if anyone at IN Group wants to reach out once you get your story straight, Alex at idtechwire.com, editor at idtechwire.com. We're happy to talk, or Idemia.
Sure, that'll do it.
Yeah, that'll do it. That'll make us lots of friends over there. But yeah, it's an ongoing story. So Danielle, thank you for giving us some insight this early in the game, and hopefully we'll get you back as this unfolds and we can kind of pick it apart even more.
Yeah, definitely. I know my team's going to be keeping an eye on it too, because like I said, Idemia is not just the big three in biometrics, but it's everywhere in a lot of our research. So if we get those inroads, we'll let you know.
Same. Yeah.
To be continued. As always, thank you, Danielle.
Absolutely.
Thank you so
Thanks
much
for having me.
Thank you.